The morning air was cool and sharp, the kind that bites at your ears and makes your breath turn to mist. A long green field stretched out behind the old wooden fence of Fort Benning, Georgia. It was the kind of place where the grass grew in uneven patches, and the wind came in slow, quiet waves from the south. It was the summer of 2003, and a group of 27 Army Rangers had gathered near the edge of that field for what was supposed to be a simple, informal shooting event. These were not ordinary soldiers. These men had just returned from overseas. They had trained for years. They could run miles through mud in full gear and still hit a target. They were young, strong, and confident. The kind of confident that comes from knowing you are very good at what you do. The event had been put together as a friendly gathering between the Ranger Battalion and some of the local community, farmers, ranchers, and families who lived in the surrounding areas. It was meant to build goodwill, share some food, and spend a quiet afternoon in the open air. A few of the local men had brought their own rifles, and a friendly shooting competition had formed naturally, the way these things do in the South. Among the locals who showed up that day was a man named Earl Dobbins. Earl was 71 years old. He arrived in a dusty pickup truck, the kind with a cracked dashboard and a worn leather seat. He wore a faded vest, old boots that had seen too many miles, and a plain hat that sat low on his forehead. His hands were large and rough. His face was lined with age, the way old wood gets when it has been out in the weather for too long. He was quiet. He did not introduce himself to many people. He did not make jokes or join in the easy banter that was going around the group. He simply walked to the line, carried his bolt-action rifle, 30-06 that looked as old as he was, and waited his turn. When the Rangers noticed him standing there, a few of them exchanged looks. One leaned toward another and said something low under his breath. A few of them smiled. It was not a mean kind of laughter, but it was laughter all the same. Here was this old man, old enough to be their grandfather, holding a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum, about to step up to a shooting line among some of the finest trained soldiers in the United States Army. Nobody said anything directly to him, but the feeling in the air was clear. Nobody expected anything. Earl did not seem to notice, or if he did not care. He stood at the line, loaded a single round into the chamber, and looked out toward the target. It was set at 600 yards. That is more than half a kilometer. At that distance, a small wind shift can move a bullet by several inches. At that distance, the target looks small enough to cover with your thumbnail. At that distance, even experienced marksmen often need 2 or 3 shots to find the correct point of impact. There was no rangefinder in Earl's hands. There was no spotter standing beside him to read the wind or make adjustments. He had only his rifle, his eyes, and something else. Something that cannot be measured or taught in any training program. He looked at the field for a long moment. He watched the way the grass moved near the tree line. He felt the direction of the wind on the left side of his face. He made some private calculation that he did not share with anyone. Then he knelt down slowly, with the careful movements of a man whose knees have been through a great deal, settled into his position, and placed the rifle to his shoulder. The crowd went quiet, not because they expected anything remarkable, but because something about the way the old man moved made people stop talking. He pulled the trigger once. The sound cracked across the field and faded into the trees. For a moment, no one moved. A sergeant major raised his binoculars and looked at the target. He looked for several seconds, then he lowered the binoculars slowly and turned to look at the old man. The shot had hit dead center. A perfect placement, right in the middle of the target, at 600 yards, on the first attempt, with iron sights and no assistance. The field was completely silent. 27 Rangers stood still. The joking had stopped. The quiet comments between friends had stopped. Everyone was looking either at the target or at Earl Dobbins, who had already stood back up and was quietly ejecting the spent casing from his rifle. One of the younger soldiers spoke first. He was maybe 22 or 23 years old, with a sharp jaw and the kind of posture that comes from years of military training. He walked over to Earl and simply asked, "Sir, where did you learn to shoot like that?" Earl looked at him for a moment. Then he said one word, "Korea." That word carried a great deal of weight. The young soldier heard it, and he understood part of what it meant. The sergeant major, who was standing nearby, heard it and understood more. Korea meant the early 1950s. It meant the Korean War. a conflict that many people called the Forgotten War, because it came between the massive story of World War II and the long, complicated story of Vietnam. Korea did not get the same attention. The men who served there did not always get the same recognition, but those who knew history understood what that war had asked of its soldiers. It had been brutal, cold, and deeply difficult. The sergeant major walked closer to Earl. He asked him which unit he had served with. Earl told him. He had been with the 1st Marine Division. The sergeant major nodded slowly. He knew what that meant. He knew about the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, which took place in late November and early December of 1950. He knew that the 1st Marine Division had been surrounded in the mountains of North Korea by an overwhelming number of enemy forces, in temperatures that dropped to nearly 35 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. He knew that men had fought for 17 days in conditions that were almost impossible to survive. Weapons jammed from the cold, supplies ran low. The terrain was steep, frozen, and merciless. And through all of that, some men had held their positions. They had protected their brothers. They had made decisions under conditions that no training exercise could ever fully prepare a person for. Earl Dobbins had been one of those men. What the young Rangers at Fort Benning did not know, what nobody in that field knew except Earl, was that his actions during those 17 days in the mountains of Korea had been formally recognized by the United States military. He had been awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration given by the Navy and Marine Corps. It sits just below the Medal of Honor. He kept it in a coffee tin inside his truck. He had never put it on a wall. He had never shown it to neighbors or talked about it at the local diner. He had driven back to Montana after the war, bought a piece of land, raised cattle, and lived quietly. He went to church on Sundays. He fixed his own fences. He woke up before the sun and worked until the light was gone. For 50 years, that is what he did. None of the people laughing at the shooting line that morning had any idea who they were looking at. After the sergeant major learned what he learned, he stood quietly for a moment. Then, without any formal order being given, without any ceremony being announced, he removed his beret. It was a small gesture, but in military culture, it carried meaning. One by one, other Rangers followed. It was not a coordinated action. Nobody told them to do it. It simply happened, the way certain things happen when a group of people suddenly understand something important all at once. 27 Rangers stood in that field, with their berets in their hands, in silence, in front of an old man, in a faded vest, who had driven over in a dusty truck. Earl looked at them. His expression did not change dramatically. He was not the kind of man to show a great deal on his face, but those who were watching closely said there was something in his eyes, a quietness that was different from the quietness of a man who feels nothing. It was the quietness of a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time and was not quite sure what to do when someone else finally noticed. The young corporal who had first spoken to Earl stayed nearby. He had returned not long ago from a difficult deployment in Iraq. He had seen things that stayed with him at night. He had done his job well, but he still carried questions that he had not found answers for. He waited until the other men had drifted back to their conversations, and then he approached Earl again. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead," Earl said. "Were you ever scared? Out there, I mean. In Korea." Earl was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the field, then he looked back at the young man. "Every single day," he said, "but fear and freeze are not the same thing. You just have to learn the difference." The corporal did not say anything back. There was nothing to add. He thought about those words for a long time afterward. He thought about them during his next deployment, and the one after that. He later told people that those 14 words from Earl Dobbins had helped him more than anything he had read in a book or heard in a briefing room. Earl Dobbins drove home that afternoon. He fed his cattle. He checked a stretch of fence on the north end of his property that had been giving him trouble. He made a simple dinner and ate it alone, the way he did most evenings. He did not think of that afternoon as anything special. He had simply done what he had always done, showed up, done the work, and gone home. He passed away in the spring of 2009, at the age of 77, in the same county where he had been born. His obituary was short. It mentioned his ranching operation, his community involvement, and the names of the family members he left behind. It did not mention Korea. It did not mention the Navy Cross in the coffee tin. but in the informal memory of those 27 rangers, in the kinds of conversations that happen around late fires and at quiet moments between soldiers who have been through things together. The story of the old rancher and the one shot at 600 yards lived on. It passed from one group of soldiers to the next, the way the best stories always do. Not because it was dramatic, not because it had a parade or a headline, but because it reminded people of something true and important. The most powerful things often come in quiet packages. The most experienced hands are sometimes the most worn ones, and the man everyone laughs at may be the one who has already done, long before you arrived, the very thing you are still preparing yourself to face. Strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walks up to the line, reads the wind, and fires once.